Gonna get us started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you're here with us this evening. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are really meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, the history, the art, and the depth and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So I have a little bit more to tell you about before this evening's talk, but we're going to take a very special moment to welcome my wonderful colleague, Linnell, our Village Preservation's Director of Development, who's here to tell us about Village Voices, of which tonight's event is a part. Linnell, hello, tell us some things.
Hi, Arielle. Thank you so much for having me as your guest tonight, along with Mr. Snyder. I'm so excited. So I'm here to tell everyone about Village Voices, which is this year's benefit. And we are inviting you to become a part of history in the making as we present this outdoor walking exhibition to the public, to all of you. It is an outdoor exhibition celebrating people, places, and moments from our neighborhood's history, inspiring us forward on the road ahead. It will be an engaging installation of exhibit boxes displayed throughout our neighborhoods, featuring photographs and artifacts and recorded narration that will provide entertaining and illuminating insight into the momentous heritage and history of the village. The benefit day is September the 12th, and I encourage you all to purchase your tickets to come to the benefit day. It will be full of incredibly interesting surprises with pop-up performances throughout the village that are tied to the exhibits and to the places. It will also have a reception at the end at Jefferson Market Garden. We'll be very careful, and the COVID protocol will be in place. Outdoors, all of it, which is really nice. But also we're creating Village Voices not only to benefit village preservation, which is really important because we need your support, but also as a tribute to our community and to the city and to the public as we celebrate the reopening of our neighborhoods. The exhibition will be open to the public for several weeks for our friends and neighbors to discover and to enjoy. Those of you who have benefit tickets will have a bespoke link app to the tour for the narration and all of the things that are going on that day. And yeah, so we hope that you will come. Arielle's is going to put the link in the chat for everyone. Yes. to visit our website.
Yes, learn more, everyone.
And because so many of our tonight's program is really because it's the 150th anniversary of the birth of John Sloan. Is that correct?
Is that right? Yes.
150th. And
born today.
Yeah, born today. John Sloan is also one of the subjects on our tour. So it's perfect synchronicity to have a program that aligns with our exhibition and our benefit. So I also want to let you know that for the public, there will be QR codes on the boxes. That when you approach a box throughout the village, there'll be East Village, Greenwich Village, NoHo. Shine your phone onto a QR code and it will give you some of the information there.
So amazing. So much to learn. I'm so excited. Mel, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody. I hope to see everybody throughout the village, and hopefully you'll come on September the 12th.
Yes, very much hope to see you there. We're doing as much as we can outdoors for sure.
Yes, we are.
Yep.
Which is a glorious place to be right now.
True, true. Well, thank you so much, Linnell, and thanks everyone for taking that detour with us. We're just really, really excited.
Thank you
Um,
so much. And I look
yeah,
forward to the lecture. Thanks.
yes, thanks, Linnell. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions, please do use the Q&A function. It just helps me to keep track of everything. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Robert Snyder is Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Rutgers University. He has worked since the 1980s with journalists, museum curators, and documentarians to share history with a broad public. Snyder has written widely on New York City history and the arts. You can look it up, it's a very long list. And since 2019 has served as Manhattan Borough Historian. Among his many publications, Snyder co-authored Metropolitan Lives, The Ashcan Artists and Their New York, which won the Barr Prize of the College Art Association. And so without further ado, Robert, thank you so much for being here. Take us away.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. I want to talk tonight about John Sloan, Greenwich Village in New York City, because I think you can't understand Greenwich Village without the terrific work that John Sloan did as an artist here. And you can't understand John Sloan without New York City. As he once said, after he came home from a long walk around town, I have soaked in something to paint. And what he meant by that was that he had been walking about in the city, absorbing its sights and its sounds. And that's what he did as a painter, immerse himself in the city and come back with his own selective observations that he would later put down on canvas, which captured in extraordinary ways a memorable period in the history of the city at the dawn of the 20th century. Sloan was born in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, and came to New York City by way of Philadelphia. He had a modest upbringing, but he was very determined and independent, traits that he would carry through the rest of his life. He was by turns an illustrator, a painter, a radical and a teacher, a walker in the city par excellence. And in Greenwich Village, not only a resident, but a man who lived out in the neighborhood a life of reinvention. I was struck by this in doing the research that I did on Sloan, that my first round of research on Sloan focused on his life in the city and his work as a painter. But I needed to learn more about his years before New York and after his heyday as a painter to understand him. And I came to the conclusion that, like so many other people, myself included, his time in Greenwich Village was a part of a period of reinventing himself and developing a new life and a new career that would sustain him for many decades after he first came here at the dawn of the 20th century. I want to just acknowledge at the very beginning that I understand John Sloan better thanks to some important people. One is Rebecca Zuria, with whom I wrote Metropolitan Lives many years ago and who went on to write what I still think is the definitive book on the Ashcan artists. Heather Campbell Coyle, who has done terrific work on John Sloan in his New York as a writer, as a historian, as a curator, and John Lokery, whose biography of Sloan was very useful to me as I prepared my talk tonight. Finally, I want to just acknowledge my own years in Greenwich Village. I lived there on Thompson Street between Bleecker and 3rd from 1980 to 1991. And as I went over the life of John Sloan, I was struck by how, in my own way, I was living out many of the patterns of reinvention and absorption with the city that defined John Sloan's life so many years before I arrived in New York. Sloan's origins as a painter really lie in his career as a newspaper and magazine illustrator. And here we see him at work at the Philadelphia Press in 1894. He had an early interest in drawing that led him to a career as a newspaper illustrator. Sloan in the 1890s, working at the Philadelphia Press, was working at a big city newspaper, to be sure, but newspapers at that time did not rely primarily on photographs to illustrate their news. They used drawings that were then reproduced in wide varieties of ways. And Sloan was part of a stable of artists at the Philadelphia Press, also the Philadelphia Inquirer, who worked to render the events of the day in visual form. Sloan was not a hard news illustrator. There were artists for newspapers who went out to look at events, sketch them roughly and very quickly, and come back to the newsroom and fill them out. Sometimes they worked individually, sometimes they worked in teams. Sloan was not really one of those. He was not a quick sketch artist. In fact, it was joked in his newspaper days that his name, Sloan, was the past participle of slow. He was not a quick sketch artist. However, he did get at the look of the city and the feel of the city, and it powerfully shaped his work. Instead of delivering hard news, he worked in newspapers and magazines, laying out designs for big Sunday supplement sections, doing individual illustrations that would accompany articles, often of a very fanciful kind, not absolutely literal renditions of what he saw, but impressions of what he saw that conveyed the mood or the feel of an event. Sloan was also very good at drawing up puzzles. This is one of the things that I learned in this latest round of research. He made incredibly elaborate puzzles in the Philadelphia newspapers. And he was much in demand. He had a good career because he was working at a moment when newspapers were becoming more visual, but photography had not yet taken over as the dominant mode of visual representation in newspapers. You see here a page from a graphically illustrated newspaper of the 1890s. It's a fanciful drawing of the battleship Maine blowing up in Havana Harbor, but it took the work of graphic artists like Sloan to bring that visual element to the front pages of a newspaper. Similarly, in the World, Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper in New York City, you saw elements of the journalism that would help frame Sloan's career and reactions to his own work, a journalism of storytelling and experience versus policy and information. Think of the World as the storytelling and experience end of this continuum, and the New York Times is the policy and information end. Woman jumps from Brooklyn Bridge, survives mad leap. This was a kind of journalism that thrived in the late 19th and early 20th century that saw drama in ordinary people and their lives and sought to make them readers of the news. And John Sloan did very well in that world as an illustrator of newspapers. Comic strips like The Yellow Kid found humor and drama in the city streets. And you see here the Yellow Kid in the standard yellow smock of a small child in the late 19th century, surrounded by political people making fun of the political scene of the day, lampooning the stuffy, the high and mighty, the genteel. All these were signs of the kind of humor and drama that newspaper artists, cartoonists, and reporters felt could be found on the city streets. But Sloan was more than an illustrator. He, as accomplished as he was, there were two things working to complicate his life. One was his craft was in its twilight years by the early 20th century. At the same time, as good an illustrator as he was, he had more complicated ambitions. He had a fascination with art that was nurtured by Robert Henry, a mentor and friend. Henry taught art classes that Sloan took in Philadelphia, and Henry was a striking character, Western in his origins, Eastern in his thriving career. He absorbed the best of the old masters and encouraged young painters like Sloan to paint the world around them, to paint the world that they saw in the city streets, but render it in memorable form, render it with painterly techniques that would recall the old masters of European painting. In that sense, Henry was a kind of high-low act, much like Walt Whitman, much like jazz. The best of America's cultural contributions, I think, combine and complicate the distinction between high art and popular culture. And Henry tapped into something profound in Sloan as he encouraged him to think about having a career as a painter. Also in Philadelphia, Sloan met Anna Dolly Wall. They were married in 1901. Dolly had a complicated life. She suffered from depression. She suffered from alcoholism. Sloan himself had bouts of depression, and he could drink too much too. So I don't think that she deserves the entire stigma that's sometimes attached to her. She too, like Sloan, would go on to be a socialist and an activist and suffragist. But together, they forged a life in Philadelphia, but increasingly recognized that if John was going to have the career that he wanted, that Philadelphia was not necessarily the place to be. As Sloan himself observed in Philadelphia, a good thing done in Philadelphia is, well, done in Philadelphia. A good thing done in New York is heralded abroad. He looked north to New York City, to a city that not only offered him better job prospects, but also a city that was an international media capital where any work that he did as either an illustrator or an artist would gain wider recognition. In 1904, John and Dolly moved to New York City. This is the beginning of an episode that would lead him to Greenwich Village, and I think mark his life for decades after that. In 1904, John and Dolly moved into the Sherwood Studio building at 589 West 57th Street. Robert Henry's studio was on the same floor. It was a neighborhood where artists were prominent. There were lots of studios. Carnegie Hall is on the same street. The building that they lived in is no longer there, but soon after arriving in New York City and settling on 57th, they moved south to 165 West 23rd Street. That building is still there. John and Dolly moved in 1904. It is now the site of the Excellent Dumpling House. I can only tell you that I've eaten at the Excellent Dumpling House when it was in Chinatown. Its name is flawed because the dumplings are perfect. They're not just excellent. I encourage you to get there. But living as they did on West 23rd Street, John and Dolly were on the edge of a fascinating neighborhood with people who would inspire Sloan's work. And through Sloan's work, we can see how a newcomer became a New Yorker. We can see how a newcomer to the city learned to navigate the metropolis. We can also see topical references. This is one of the things that both drew Rebecca Zurier and me together in 1985 when we first met, when we were pre-doctoral students at the Smithsonian Institution. I was working on a dissertation about vaudeville. Rebecca was working on a dissertation about the Ashcan artists. I was fascinated to see how the paintings of artists like John Sloan revealed details of life in the city that couldn't be found any other way. Rebecca was fascinated to see that the buildings and intersections in the Ashcan artists' paintings had actual references to places and events in New York City in the early 20th century. Together, Rebecca and I realized that we had something to learn from each other, just as John Sloan had something to learn from New York City. New York City had been consolidated into the 5-borough metropolis that we know in 1898. It was now by far the nation's largest city, but it was something even more than that. It was a city of the world, as Walt Whitman put it earlier, with a dynamic media culture and a vigorous art scene. New York was a seaport, an industrial powerhouse, and a communications center. It had been a communications center since the middle of the 19th century, with the rise of the penny press, the rise of the book publishing industry, and later the arrival of telegraphy in the city. It was also, thanks to its status as a port city, a city of immigrants. Lewis Hine was photographing new arrivals at Ellis Island. In 1900, Mulberry Street was in the middle of the Lower East Side. Right there on Mulberry Street, you see the Little Italy section of the Lower East Side, the most densely populated neighborhood in the United States of America. Here we see how immigrant families working to put together a living would work at home in their apartments, putting together sewing, making small flowers or floral arrangements. This reduced the overhead for the businessmen that hired them, but it made their own dwellings crowded and sometimes fire hazards. It was a city of big daily newspapers. We see here the world again that found drama in the everyday life of ordinary New Yorkers. Let's look at the World, which was aimed at a very wide readership that included immigrants. Floods stopped subway, big rush hour crowd unable to get home. Girl stabbed 10 times in Delrick's auto. Again, seeking drama in everyday life in the city. There was also a thriving immigrant press in the city. Here is the Forwards, the Jewish Yiddish language newspaper, but it was hardly alone in being part of the immigrant press. Italian language newspapers, Chinese language newspapers, German language newspapers, all thrived in the big city. Also present in the city was muckraking journalism. This was a period when middle-class Americans had a rising concern about industry, a rising concern about political corruption, and when the presence of immigrants and workers in big cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, and Philadelphia were pushing new questions of labor and social welfare onto the political agenda of the nation. Muckraking journalism in McClure's magazine covered all of these extensively. New York was a dynamic city, the capital of capitalism, but also a site of great cultural and political ferment. Mass transit was expanding the city out to Brooklyn. In 1904, when the IRT subway line started moving north through the city, it brought people out of the lower part of Manhattan on the Lower East Side and moved them up to neighborhoods like Harlem, Washington Heights, and then eventually the Bronx. Halftone reproductions were becoming more and more common, like this picture on the front of the World newspaper here, making the work of artists like Sloan less remunerative, less available for them. At the same time, newspapers, department stores, and theaters were centerpieces of urban culture. Here's Herald Square on 34th Street in 1910. It's depicted in a colored postcard. Department stores, theaters were all prominent there, but newspapers were so important to the city's civic culture that the square is named after the Herald newspaper. Likewise, the Times Square, named for the New York Times, here depicted about 1910 with the New York Times building front and center, a growing national center for theater, performance, and entertainment that was outstripping neighborhoods a little bit further south, like the one where Sloan lived on 23rd Street when he first arrived in New York City. New York, as Sloan encountered it, was also a city of political ferment. Demonstrations against child labor were common in a city where young people often had to go to work to support immigrant families. And you see here the slashes in both English and in Yiddish. One more testament, if anyone was needed, to the fact that this was a polyglot city in which an overwhelmingly immigrant working class was struggling to make its way. The suffrage parade in New York City of 1915 was another reminder of the political currents that coursed through the city. John and Dolly Sloan both supported the cause of women's suffrage, and it was the vote of immigrants, particularly Jewish immigrant men, that ultimately helped make suffrage pass in New York City and New York State. Before he took up residence in the Village, John Sloan lived in Chelsea, close by centers for urban amusements and working class residents, and also near Gramercy Park, where Robert Henry, his friend and mentor, lived. Living in Chelsea on 23rd Street, he could witness all sorts of institutions like bars, the lower end of the theater district. He was surrounded by working class residents whose appearance fascinated them, even though he wasn't one of them. Like for many other native-born Americans, the immigrants in the city introduced Sloan to the idea that there were more than one way of thinking, behaving, conducting yourself in the city. Way back in the middle of the 19th century, German immigrants had convinced New Yorkers that it was possible indeed for men and women and families to gather in beer gardens and drink a glass of beer together without moral dissolution following. By the early 20th century, Jewish and Italian immigrants had taken over the task of introducing native-born Americans to the idea that there was more than one way of living in the city. Sloan, in 1912, leased a studio in the Vara-type building at 6th Avenue and Cornelia Street. The building, thankfully, is still there, and it put him in the middle of the village as a workplace. The village then was a center of cultural creativity and political radicalism. There were characters like Emma Goldman, the anarchist, who was a friend of the Sloans, John Reed of the Masses magazine, who was a colleague of John's at the Masses and a radical journalist in his time. The Sloans in 1912 moved to 155 East 22nd Street. They rented an apartment at this address. The building is still there. So he was working in the village, but living just outside it. And here at 155 East 22nd, not far from his friend and mentor, Robert Henry. In October 1912, they moved to 61 Perry Street. Again, the building is still there, thanks to historic preservation. There's a detail of the front door that they would have walked in. And then in 1913 to 240 West 4th Street, again, a building that they lived in that's still there in Greenwich Village. Sloan grasped many things about New York City, but one of them is it was a big dynamic city, but it was not so large, and that individuals in it were overwhelmed in any way. And this is a theme that begins to come through in his art. As early as 6 o'clock winter, 1912, here's an elevated train coursing over a rush hour. The train, to be sure, is big and dynamic, but so is the crowd. This is Walt Whitman's kind of crowd, big, dynamic, organic, many different kinds of people in it, men and women close together, elbow to elbow. It turns an everyday experience of riding the train home at the end of the workday and makes it part of a dynamic urban experience. But Sloan's New York, as he painted it, was also a gregarious city. At McSorley's Bar, which had been there from the middle of the 19th century and allowed only men until the 1970s, Sloan hung out and offered a painting, which I just think gets at the quality of light in that place so well. You can just see it coming in through the right-hand side of the painting. And again, it's all men, all talking to each other, but they're talking to each other. They're not watching television. They're not checking their phones. They're not looking down into their drinks alone. Sloan was aware of how city people communicated with each other in multiple ways and multiple kinds of settings. For Sloan, the city was not an anonymous place. It was not a place of alienation between people. On Reaganesky's Saturday Night, which he did in 1912, he captured another fact about the city, that increasingly young women were socializing on their own in the city. As they moved to the city to work in its growing industries, they found ways to live on their own, socialize on their own, and move through the city's landscape independently from the supervision of fathers, brothers, uncles, men back in their hometowns or big city neighborhoods. Sloan himself moved happily in a circle of artists and writers. In this painting, Yates at Pettipas, executed in 1910. If you look at the far left-hand side, you see the man with the white beard smoking the cigar. That's John Butler Yeats, father of the poet. Next to him over here is Dolly Sloan. There's John Sloan. And the rest of the inhabitants of this circle are artistic and literary people of note, gathering in a boarding house run by French sisters. Sisters in the sense of siblings, not nuns of any kind. Sloan always had a slightly bohemian cast to the friends that he cultivated inside and outside Greenwich Village. Sloan's painting South Beach Bader, there's 1907 to 1908, gets at another piece of the reality of New York, which is that the city had its nationwide entertainment districts in places like Times Square or Coney Island, but also other entertainment districts around the city. South Beach was, in effect, the Coney Island of Staten Island, with middle-class and working-class entertainment possibilities there on the beach. And you see all sorts of things of this in Sloan. There's a kind of relaxed body language of men and women gathered together. You see this guy eyeing this woman. This is a constant tendency in Sloan's art. Men and women are also always checking each other out. He's looking at her too. She's adjusting her hat, perhaps even aware that people are looking at her, aware that she's part of an urban drama in which people display themselves on the street and work to get noticed. At the same time, Sloan was aware that as visible as New Yorkers were to each other, they also found private moments in the middle of all this visibility. This is one of my favorite John Sloan paintings, Pigeons, 1910. Pigeon racing was a popular sport in Sloan's New York, and I've seen people racing pigeons still in New York City. You heard them on top of a roof and use this flag here, usually a mop handle with a rag tied to it, to orient the pigeons. It's very competitive. You want your pigeons to fly off and come back, but also persuade other people's pigeons to join your flock. But here you have a father and a son on a rooftop enjoying this together. Sloan often looked at people from across the space between buildings or across rooftops and got the sight of them even when they were unaware that Sloan might be looking at them. Critics have said that gives his work a certain voyeuristic quality, and I think there's something to that. But the gaze he applies is always interested and not threatened, I think, anyway, and not judgmental either. Sunday, women drying their hair, 1912. Sloan said he could see this from his office in Cornelia Street. And what I like about this is that these women are thoroughly relaxed among themselves. They don't know that Sloan is watching them. They're not performing them. They're putting themselves together before going out. At the same time, Sloan recognized that rooftops where people hung out laundry to dry were very much women's spaces. Other artists would make the same notice all the way in through the 1930s and 1940s. Women who worked doing the family's laundry often cultivated the rooftop as a place of their own where they strung out lines of laundry. At the same time, by the 1930s and 40s, in tabloid newspapers, you could see photos of young people turning the rooftop into Tar Beach, a place where they could sun themselves with some privacy from their elders and supervision. Here's one of Sloan's etchings from a series that he did called New York City Life, Roof's Summer Night, 1906. In a country where middle-class people were just starting to emerge from the idea of keeping your private life closed up and in decorous fashion at home, here's a working-class family sleeping on a roof. This was a common tactic in the hot summers in New York City. My father grew up in the city in the 1920s and late teens, and he remembers sleeping on fire escapes in the same way. Social workers would describe people carrying mattresses to the banks to the East River to beat the heat. Here's Sloan. There's a family sleeping on a mattress. There's the mother, there's the father, there are children at their feet. And here again is this Sloan character looking across the distance at the family sleeping there. For middle-class people, this would be surprising, maybe to some even still shocking, but for millions of working people who had to cope with the heat, who couldn't afford to go to the mountains or to the shore for the summer, this was how they survived. Sloan captured small moments like this, like the Carmine Theater in the West Village, and this nun walking past a group of young people. And this, one of my favorites, 3 a.m. 1909. It's the combination of privacy, the combination of being on a special schedule. This is 3 a.m. These women are either getting home from work or getting up very early to go to work. One critic I know says maybe they're prostitutes. It's possible. But what I like about it so much is the way their body language is turned in ways that make them communicate with both us and each other. The woman with the teacup is chatting animatedly with her comrade. Her comrade's working on making some tea or maybe some eggs. But her body language, again, is oriented slightly towards us. They're not so absorbed in themselves that they are inward looking. They are drawn inward. They are rather facing out in different ways. At the same time, Sloan grasped how in a big anonymous city, there were possibilities for moments of privacy. ways of being alone. This painting, Wake of the Ferry 2, executed in 1907, gets at this really well. In 1907, as they would still be for years to come, and now there are again today, ferries were a common presence on New York Harbor. They took people back and forth, not only between New York and Staten Island, but also between New York and New Jersey. Dolly often rode the ferry to New Jersey to take the train when she went home to Philadelphia after she and John moved to New York. And I love how this painting gets at the sense of solitude that a person can have in the middle of a great and busy city. Sloan also recognized that the city could be cruel. 6th Avenue and 30th in 1907 would have had a lot of resonances for people. On one, it would have been recognized this was the edge of the Tenderloin, a nightlife and entertainment district with lots of vice. These two sharply dressed women there. The hats sometimes suggest that they might be prostitutes, maybe, maybe not. These are corner guys eyeing the pedestrian traffic that goes by. This woman draws on an account that Sloan left of a woman who was probably drunk, wandering the streets, confused about where she was. Dolly herself had moments like that, and Sloan tried to snap her out of them in a variety of ways, including keeping a diary that he would show to her to show her how much he thought of her and how much she was on his mind. But he also grasped that women could be vulnerable in this city and that people with problems would often not be taken care of properly. And again, Sloan saw on all sorts of levels, this was a city where people interacted with each other in all sorts of complicated ways. Movie theaters were a new phenomenon in 1907 when he created Movies 5 Cents. Here we see what was in all likelihood an early Nickelodeon. These were inexpensive theaters where small-scale entrepreneurs, often immigrants, set up entertainments with a screen, a movie projector in the back of the room, and seats, often benches, in front of the screen. What's striking is two things. There's an African-American woman here, a relatively rare but not unknown presence in Sloan's paintings. There was still a fair bit of segregation in New York City audiences in these years, and so she's in the back row. But here's a woman looking at the painter, and she's looking at Sloan. I mean, again, that phenomenon of women and men looking at each other in the painting is very common with Sloan. And it looks like we have two people kissing here on a park bench. Again, that's the kind of risque for its time theme that you could find in early motion pictures, which ran very short and showed short scenes, sometimes actualities on city streets, sometimes vaudeville acts or comic acts that were posed before a camera and let the camera roll. Haymarket 1907 is one of my favorites because it gets at lots of things all at once. The Haymarket was a concert saloon. It was run by people who would have enjoyed political connections, but Sloan gets at lots of things in this. The women who are going in may well be prostitutes. Again, the very big fancy hats are often thought to be a marker of that in paintings in this time. But what Sloan understands is that in a place like this, rough and respectable coexist very close to each other. Here are women walking in. Here's a bouncer on the corner. Maybe he's a Tammany man also who keeps an eye on the place. But there are kids in the neighborhood too. Here's a little boy playing. He looks like he's got a hoop that he's rolling. Here's a little girl walking along with her mother. Now, the girl is fascinated by what she sees. She looks inside to see what she can see inside the Haymarket. If she could see all the way in, she'd see a bar. She might see a musical act as well. But the mother doesn't want her looking in there because this is a place with a risque reputation. Any parent who has tried to protect their kids from these kind of fascinations and influences would be fascinated with this and familiar with the problem. But Sloan gets at the vice, gets at the rough, gets at the respectable, gets at the family, and shows how all of them could be combined together in one neighborhood, in one city. And it confounded some of those old Victorian expectations in which people were either virtuous or vice-ridden. proper or improper. What Sloan was getting at here, I think, is a thoroughly modern understanding that we're all a bit of a mix of high and low, rough and respectable. Politics and art also were a concern for Sloan. He was a man with leftist sympathies in a time when the left was strong in New York City, and he found politics and art a difficult mix. He was a very independent thinker, and he didn't want politics to overwhelm his art. In the time when Sloan was an active artist in New York City, Eugene Debs was a socialist presidential candidate. Sloan joined the Socialist Party in 1910 and remained a member until 1916. John and Dolly were both politically active. John drew for The Call, a socialist newspaper, and in 1910, he ran for the New York State Assembly as a socialist. In 1911, when the Triangle Factory fire took place on Washington Square, John did this illustration: rent, profit, interest, the dead garment workers who died in the fire or jumping from the Triangle Factory, the skeleton here, the big businessman there. For Sloan, this would have been a tragedy that occurred in a neighborhood he knew well, in a Greenwich Village that he knew well. In 1913, Sloan joined with other radicals and artists to stage a pageant in support of the Patterson Silk Strikers over in New Jersey. The pageant featured performances by the strikers themselves and throngs of strikers marching through the streets of Manhattan, having ferried over from New Jersey. The industrial workers of the world were prominent in the leadership of the strike, and the pageant very much captured the energies of the bohemian left and artists in the village that Sloan was comfortable with. Sloan joined the editorial board of the freewheeling radical magazine, The Masses, in 1912 and remained there for 4 years. He was not one to mix art and politics, as I've said, but in this cover that he did for The Masses in July 1913, I just see so much of Sloan's traditional fascinations. Here's the woman there. These women are probably garment workers. They work in a garment factory at this point, not just an apartment sweatshop. And they're doing all the Sloan things. One is looking over her shoulder at somebody who's attracted her attention. This one is looking at you, the painter or the viewer. At the same time, they may be returning from toil, but their spirits aren't cowed. They have a strength, they have a vitality that I think is really admirable and really fascinating. Sloan could also express great anger in his political art, something that he tried to keep out of the other work that he did as an artist. As a painter, here's a cover of The Masses in June 1914 about an attack on striking miners in the state of Colorado. There's a miner in the middle of a pile of dead bodies, cradling his dead child in his arms, firing at the National Guard and vigilantes as they advance on the strikers' camp. In 1917, Sloan and some friends, Marcel Duchamp and others, snuck into Washington Square Arch. They climbed to the roof to celebrate and announce their secession from the USA. They hoped that, jokingly, President Woodrow Wilson would recognize them. In many ways, it feels like the classic act of the radical, bohemian, artistic, literary world of Greenwich Village in the early 20th century. In retrospect, it is really an elegy for an era. There's Sloan on the right-hand side, thoroughly enjoying himself on top of the arch. Only a year later, the United States entered World War I. Sloan bitterly opposed the war, which brought to an end the progressive reform and radical politics that shaped his early years in New York City. The Masses, for example, was banned from the mails. Socialists were driven from politics. The world that Sloan had thrived in really came to an end. Sloan would remain leftish in his politics for the rest of his life. Instead of the Lower East Side in the era of World War I, as African Americans migrated from the South to the North to seize economic opportunities, Harlem in Upper Manhattan replaced the Lower East Side as a center of cultural and political ferment. The Harlem Renaissance took off in the 1920s, and African Americans made their powerful entry into US politics popular culture and entertainment off that basis. They also claimed a neighborhood for themselves on a scale and vitality that simply had not yet been the case in New York City before the Great Migration began. So the world that Sloan lived in, of radical Greenwich Village, of radical Lower East Side, this was beginning to lose energy. A new kind of New York was emerging in the years after World War I. In 1919, John and Dolly began to spend summers in Santa Fe. Here they are working in their garden there. He began to absorb new artistic influences, new regional topics, move on to doing portraits and nudes, experiment with new techniques in painting. He continued to teach in New York. And one of the things that struck me was how this next phase of his life, Sloan would be very well known as a teacher, a demanding teacher to be sure, but a well-regarded teacher. Here's his painting, Jefferson Market, executed in 1917 and retouched in 1922. It's unlike a lot of Sloan's work, it's done from a distance. I think Sloan's best work was about engaging people on the street, one-on-one, over a short distance. This is like some of his later paintings, which are more panoramic, more done from a distance, in which people get lost and the landscape looms large. The City from Greenwich Village, 1922, is one of Sloan's most famous paintings. And for me, it's fascinating. It, in effect, presents the city as a glow on the horizon that's to be achieved. Yet by 22, Sloan had done some of his best work in New York City. And he experienced this very ironic turn in his own life. In the earlier years of the 20th century, he was a thoroughly modern man. But as his Greenwich Village began to recede into history and abstraction began to become a growing theme in American art, Sloan, over the decades that would follow World War I, became a figure with strong historical associations, but to many people, he seemed less and less contemporary all the time. Here's Wet Night, Washington Square, 1928. Again, still Sloan's world, but really done from a distance and without the people in it that so powerfully characterized his street scenes of New York City in the early 20th century. From 1927 to 1935, Sloan lived on Washington Square South. He and Dolly had a home in the studio at the western edge of this complex at 53 Washington Square South. It's still there. It's an NYU building, and Dolly and John lived there for 8 years before NYU evicted them. They moved into the Chelsea Hotel on West 23rd Street. They took up an apartment and studio on the 10th floor, and the Chelsea Hotel would be their final home in New York City. Dolly would die in 1943. A year later, John married Helen Farr, his former student who he painted here in 1947. Helen Farr Sloan would go on to teach, become an artistic patron, and help make the Delaware Art Museum the foremost repository of John Sloan's papers and works. John here portrayed himself in 1946, 5 years before he would die in 1951. He commented on his life once, maybe I didn't stick to one kind of thing long enough. I'm not sure about that. I think John lived a life of reinvention that's consistent with the best possibilities of New York City and the best possibilities of Greenwich Village. The idea that if you move to New York or the Village from someplace else, you can start a new life and start over again. Might not be easy, but you can live out a life that will be more rewarding and more exciting than the one you started out with. In John's case, in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, or in Philadelphia. Greenwich Village, since John Sloan, has gone through sort of waves of evolution, but they've always been characterized by the presence of different generations of radicals, musicians, and artists. One thing that I noticed when I lived in the Village from the 80s into the early 90s, everyone told you that you should have been here 20 years ago. So if it was 80, people said you should have been here in the 60s. If you were in the 60s, you should have been there in the 40s with Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. If you were there in the 40s, you should have been there with Malcolm Cowley. And if you were there in the 40s, you should have been there in the 20s, with the last days of John Sloan and so on and on. I think that's because there's a current of the arts and dissent that lingers in the village that acquires a different expression in different generations. Thanks to historic preservation, many buildings from John Sloan's Greenwich Village remain with us. We see here Judson Memorial Church and that whole complex in which Dolly and John made their home. But compared to the rest of New York, the village has changed. I was struck by this on some research that I did recently. It's wider, it has fewer people in poverty, a higher household income, higher rents, less public housing, and fascinating to me, more property crime than other neighborhoods in New York City. Young artists and aspiring writers like me move to other neighborhoods often seeking affordable rents. And I think it's that difficulty of young people getting started in New York City and affordable housing in general that is one of the biggest challenges that faces New York City today. Still, when you walk down 61 Perry Street on an early summer morning, as I did this summer, or when you look at Sloan's painting of McSorley's bar or visit the bar today, or you look at Sloan's pigeons, you can see the city through the eyes of someone who's getting to know it firsthand from the bottom up during an extraordinary moment in time. And John Sloan's Greenwich Village does not seem that long ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so brilliant and incredible. It's such a gift to see all of that amazing artwork.
Thank you.
The light, the colors, everything. We have a number of questions, and folks who are here with us, if you do have questions, this is a great time to put them into the Q&A. So grateful to all of you for your participation. We have a couple of questions about John and Doris and how
Dolly.
much, I'm sorry, Dolly, and how much they moved around. It seems like they were in a different place all the time. Was that like rent related?
They moved a lot. They did move a lot. The studio was the steadying point in his life, the studio on 6th Avenue at Cornelia, right? Otherwise, they did move a lot, especially when they first came to New York City. Eventually, when they settled on West 4th, that's where they stayed for a long time. But before that, they were really in Chelsea. I mean, it's fascinating. He almost sort of circles around New York City, right? He talks about going to New York, then he goes to New York. He moves to an artist neighborhood on 57th briefly in the same building as Sloan. Then he moves downtown to what we today think of as Chelsea, on the edge of the Tenderloin, a kind of nightlife district, where he would have absorbed all sorts of sights and sounds of people that would have fascinated them and did fascinate him, right? He then establishes a studio in the village, but he does the studio in the village some years before he actually settles into living in the village. And he lives in the village in that Judson Memorial Church complex that NYU owns, far longer than he lived in any other one place in the village. And that to me was really engrossing. And I was struck by, again, not only by how many places he lived in the village, but how many of them are there. And I think that's a great testament to historic preservation in the village, right? And a thought occurred to me. Do the people who live there know who came before them? Do they know that they're living in John Sloan's old building? I don't know. And if they knew, would it matter to them? I would love to find out. I am thinking of knocking on some doors. I'm an old newspaper reporter, and it's the way to get questions answered.
Absolutely. If you do, I want to hear what you find out. Okay. David wants to know, were many of the Ashcan School artists also former illustrators?
Yes, this is a common thread in all of them, save actually really for Henry. All of them had some background in graphic journalism, design, or newspaper illustration. It's a common thread in greater and lesser degrees. Of them, Sloan was one of the ones who actually didn't do much on-the-spot sketching. He did more design, big features, things that could be done more slowly. But other members of the Ashcan group tended to specialize in the quick details. Some of my favorite work by the Ashcan artists that we showed in the exhibit Metropolitan Lives decades ago were actually the sketches that they worked up on street corners, because they capture people's body language and behavior in public in ways that are utterly unforgettable. Sloan didn't do that kind of work. He worked from memory, and then he started to paint when he got home. So some of his work lacks the immediacy of those sketches, but I think he gets at a depth of color and sensation and atmosphere that's really moving. I think his sense of light, for example, is really extraordinary. That comes through in Pigeons, it comes through in McSorley's, in 3 a.m., it comes in Wake of the Ferry, where it's the absence of light in that very gray scene that I think is so revealing of the different moods of the city and how a person might fit into them.
Thanks. We have a question from Bill Wander. Hi, Bill, who is the historian of McSorley's Bar.
Oh, wonderful.
Bill says, Sloan claimed to have visited McSorley's 4 or 5 times, yet he painted 5 paintings, 1 charcoal, and 1 etching. He never painted anything else so many times. Do we believe him that he was only there 4 or 5 times? He painted McSorley's Bar in April of 1912. Are the bar patrons discussing the sinking of the Titanic?
I can't know, but I can't speak directly to your question, but it has haunted me to think about the levels of conversation that have echoed under the roof of McSorley's, right? And even by 1912, John Sloan would have been aware of that. Right, he would have been aware of the memorabilia over the bar from guys who left the neighborhood to go fight in the Civil War. Right, he would have been aware of the memorabilia behind the bar of people who were immigrants. Right, and so there's levels and layers of history in McSorley's that Sloan, I think, would have been aware of. I'm struck by this, and that it seems like a small point, but when John Sloan was born in the 1870s, the Civil War was recent history. Custer's last stand had yet to happen. And he died during the Korean War in the atomic age. He was making jokes about that when he ran into Robert Frost. He was born into a city that was illuminated by gaslight, and he spent most of his adult life living in a city that was illuminated by electricity. In fact, one critic has observed that there's a gaslit quality to the Ashcan artist's paintings that's really striking and that really sets them off. Sloan lived through an extraordinary period of change, and at the same time experienced the kind of dislocation from going from being a thoroughly modern guy. He was a modern man in 1910. He was a suffragist. He was a socialist. His art was cutting edge for the time. And yet by the time he died, he could be angry and bitter that realist art was treated as if it was something passé that, didn't have a place anymore. I know that doesn't speak to what you said about McSorley's, but I'm glad you're the historian of McSorley's, and we should talk sometime. I've been there enough. I'll be there again. I would like to know more about it.
Love that. I'll put you two in touch. Speaking of him being a socialist, we have a question from Marie. It seems like he moved away from the socialist movement. Do you know why?
He had arguments with people on the masses sometimes because he felt that they wanted to put too much politics into the artwork, and he really kept politics out of his art. He really kept them separate, and I find that fascinating, and in ways I find it really admirable. He could do political art, right? His covers for the masses are really biting and they're angry, but if you look at his paintings, they're not so. I mean, it's really different. He has a general loyalty and a general sympathies. I think he's very sympathetic to working class life. I think he's very sympathetic to women in the city, right? But I think at the same time, they're not overt ideological statements. And to the end of his life, and he was leftish in his politics, but very much a kind of prickly and independent thinker, who didn't want to be told what to think, what to say, what to write by anyone.
Thanks. I appreciate that. We have a couple of questions from Andrew and Eve about Hopper and if they knew each other, how were their influences, there are some, it seems like there are some similarities in
Yeah,
their
they
art
did.
and
They did.
many.
Yes, they did. And they knew each other. And, they were, it's interesting. So Sloan establishes a trend that later generations of artists would pick up on. Just as Jacob Riis showed that you could photograph the city and you could photograph poverty in the city, right? Subsequent generations of documentary photographers would see themselves as building on his legacy. And Hopper's work, in his own way, builds on Sloan's legacy. Sloan makes it thoroughly respectable, in the best sense of the term, to do paintings of everyday life in big cities. But there's such a difference between the feel of the city and in the two artists' work. I mean, a friend of mine said, if you look at 3 a.m., if that was done by Hopper, the one woman would be staring into her coffee cup and the other one would be fixed on the frying pan on the top of the stove. There would be no communication between them. Hopper's paintings are so often, I think, about being lonely or alone in a big city. Sloan has that. Look, in that painting of that drunk woman on the corner in the Tenderloin, in that Wake of the Ferry, those people are alone and very, very lonely. But I think, as a rule, Hopper's city is a gregarious city. It's a city where people are in communication with each other. And that's, I think, different from Hopper's New York City.
Thanks for that. Let's see. We have a question about where John Sloan's work is collected. Where people can see large collections of his work, and also, did his work sell in his lifetime? Was he successful at that?
He would brag that, he was not 40 years old before he made money on a painting. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it took him a while to get started. He, again, was a very successful illustrator before he made his name as a painter. His work has been exhibited widely. He was the subject of shows during his lifetime, particularly in his latter years. There was a great Sloan show at the Delaware Art Museum. I highly recommend the book. I'll show it on the screen. John Sloan's New York. It's really worth looking at. It's really worth reading. Done by the Delaware Art Museum and Yale University Press. The Delaware Art Museum has an enormous amount of Sloan's papers up online. You can see sketches that he did, memos that he wrote. I strongly encourage you to visit there and check it out. I was looking at it as I did my research. I couldn't possibly do justice to it, but it's really very well worth visiting.
Amazing. Thanks.
Helen Farr Sloan, his second wife, really did tremendous work, not just in encouraging other artists, but also in really giving his work a firm base in its storing, in its catalog, in its interpretation. So we owe a lot to her. She's gone, but the work she did enabled other scholars, art historians, and critics to look at Sloan's work going forward.
Thanks. Let's see. Kevin wants to know, why was Sloan seemingly so uninfluenced by European modernism? Did he see the Armory show of 1913?
He did, but but it was not his it was not his modernity. I mean, I think the thing to grasp about him was that he didn't see abstraction as a higher form. He thought that what he was doing, confounding the rough and respectable, was on the cutting edge of his time. It turned out that he wasn't. I mean, Western art took a really different turn, and it left him in a funny place. And I think that is where some of his crustiness at the end of his life comes from. I personally don't find the work that he did after the 20s as compelling as the work as he did in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I think his immersion in New York City is an incredibly exciting period in his life. And if his painting after that is not so exciting, I think his work as a teacher was exciting. And this, I guess, is what I mean by his life of reinvention. It's not that he stopped influencing other artists. I mean, Reginald Marsh, right? Reginald Marsh, studied with John Sloan. Reginald Marsh went on to have an exciting career, and you can't imagine one without the other. And, Alexander Calder studied with John Sloan. I mean, Sloan was a teacher in the third phase of his life. And I think, as a former teacher, that deserves respect and appreciation too.
Michelle wants to know, did he ever teach at the Art Student League?
Yes, he taught. Yes, that was where he started teaching. Yes, exactly. It's exactly where he taught. He had a rep for being a demanding teacher. He was not easy. He could be cutting. He demanded a lot. I mean, his mentor, Robert Henry, was always encouraging you as an artist to put your passion, your energy, your commitment into your art. And if Sloan thought you stumbled or held back, he was not shy about letting you know.
I appreciate that. We have a couple of questions about Don Freeman's portrait of John Sloan. And if you know what their relationship was.
Sorry, I don't. I can't speak to that. You know, I'm an urban historian. What fascinates me about Sloan is how through his paintings, we can enter into the eyes of somebody making sense of a city, right? And it's art historians like, my colleague, Rebecca Zurier, my friend, Rebecca Zurier, who could tell you more about Sloan in the world of art historical work. I felt that when Rebecca and I worked together, it was one of the most productive partnerships I've ever worked in because we had really different strengths and we brought them together in a complementary way. So my cheap answer to that is I'll leave that for Rebecca on another day. And I'm sorry for that.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Okay, let me just, okay. Apparently, Don Freeman was a student of his, and he has a portrait of John Sloan at the Whitney. Thanks, Kenneth. Let me see. Bill says, since Helen F. Sloan died, the estate wants astronomical prices to publish his work. It's keeping his work at prohibitive prices, and so much that I've had to pass on using them. Have you found that?
I haven't found that, but I haven't found that, but I haven't been in a situation where I was going to pay huge reproduction fees, right? I will say this, what's available digitally online is really impressive. Now, I know that what's available online is not necessarily his paintings, right? There are a lot of sketches that he did. There are a lot of notes and things that he wrote. But I think that if you want to understand John Sloan, the material that's been put up online digitally is really worth a close look. I was impressed by what they have.
Oh, amazing. And I'm going to ask just one last question, though I know that we could talk about this all evening long. Terry wants to know, was Sloan involved in the WPA project in the 1930s?
Yes, he was. Yes, in fact, I am going up to Bronxville. It's where one of his murals is. Yes, he was involved in the WPA. He took some heat in that because people say it's supposed to be for starving artists. You're not starving. You're established. But I think the point was to get artists working. I am really eager to see what he did up there. So I will visit it. And it was one of the nice things that I learned about Sloan and his work.
That's so great. Well, thank you so very much for all of this beautiful art and history and art history. Thank you to everyone who has attended. I'm going to send out a follow-up email with a bunch of links from various things that we have talked about this evening. So the books that have been mentioned and the papers and various things. So keep an eye out for that. And there's just a brief survey in there. We always love your feedback about our events and how to make them better. Thank you so much to everyone, and to you, Robert, especially. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for the event. Thank you, Ariel and Lanil. And I want to thank you for all the work you do, not just in preservation, but in education. The way you put those two together, I think, is absolutely terrific and should be emulated everywhere.
Thank you. It means so much to us. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Have a good night. Hope to see you soon.
Good night all. Thank you very much.